The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 3. The Small Man. Chapter 6. Bolshevik Will to Power. Marx invited the other countries of Europe, in his time, to gaze at England, for in England they would see their own future, of 50 years thence, reflected, he said. England was already treading the path they in due course must tread, that was his theory. On the same principle, by scrutinizing contemporary Russia or Italy we today can see where we shall be some years hence. We can get there without catastrophe. The present rulers of Russia or Italy, we must assume, are imbued with a creative, compassionate emotion for the human being. But they are intelligent enough to perceive, it seems, that he is a very helpless child, dependent on others, like a horse or dog. They realize that he finds his greatest happiness in a state of dependence and subservience when, an important condition, it is named freedom. It matters very little, then, if you outrage often, as you must do to rule successfully, the most elementary principles of freedom. He will be happier with you, dependent, than with other people, independent. Men will always get their happiness out of words, whatever is popularly and scientifically said to the contrary. Put a word on him, as God put his word on the Israelites, and he is yours, and as happy as an enthusiastic dog. But the wise ruler, and I am assuming that in the world today there is really such a ruler, would see quite well, if I am correct, has seen that there must be a master. Some one or other has to assume responsibility for the ignorant millions. And their expression of their willingness and determination to assume power, even to wrest power from those who abuse it, where necessary, is the personal announcement on the part of the Russian rulers, or the rulers of Italy, of their accepting this situation. A very interesting book has recently appeared on the questions that are occupying us here. It is called After Lenin, and is by Michael Farbman. Mr. Farbman, I gather, is an independent, non-partisan observer. But he is undoubtedly very much in sympathy with the Soviet regime, and very well informed. At this point I will make a fairly long quotation from his book. He deals with great candor and clearness with the facts as they present themselves to him. We could not, I think, have a better guide, or one whose conclusions correspond more nearly with those I am expressing throughout this essay. The important point to grasp, he writes, in any consideration of the political future of Russia is the fact that a new ruling class is being evolved. Russia has never been so fortunate as to possess a ruling class in the European sense of that word. Certainly the nobility was, traditionally, the first order in the empire. But the nobles never actually exercised real power, though the bureaucracy was recruited from them. It was in fact independent of them as a class. It was, indeed, independent of any class, absolutely isolated. Certainly the monarchy and bureaucracy were accustomed to invoke the name of the nobility in any reform they initiated. But, as a matter of fact, the nobility, having no instrument of publicity in their hands, had never any direct or immediate say in such matters. And though the monarchy was permeated with the feudal ideas of the nobility was in no proper sense the ruling class. The nobles had many privileges but no political power. They were the foundation of the state, but they could make no claim to being the state. The merchants, the bourgeoisie, on the other hand, had infinitely less influence in state affairs than the nobles. Not even in an elementary form could they acquire the position of a ruling class. The peculiarity of political life in Russia has been the complete absence of the party system. There were many groups in opposition, but a party in power never existed. No party, up to the creation of the Duma, ever contemplated the possibility of assuming power. The revolutionary parties, too, though determined to smash all and every government, never contemplated the idea of assuming themselves the government of the country, and indeed were entirely opposed to taking any part in it. Members of Russian revolutionary parties have generally been intellectuals of the Dostoevsky type, idealists and dreamers, introspective, doubting, hesitating, diffident. Propagandists and conspirators, they were never men of action, they never even expected to have to act, except perhaps in a spasmodic and impulsive fashion. These men showed themselves capable of great self-sacrifice, but when the success of the revolution of 1917 threw them up and they were called to assume power in the state, they proved themselves not only inexperienced, as might have been expected, but timid and perverse. At the very moment when the West was looking for the arrival of the strong man who should dissolve this hopeless chaos, of the early days of the revolution, and stem this flood of words, Lenin emerged. Lenin supplied what had always been lacking in previous Russian parties, a program and a purpose. The organized and businesslike persistence of the little group of Bolsheviks was bound to meet with success, for they brought with them new methods of political activity and a relation to life quite unusual in Russia. What was new and really surprisingly new about the Bolsheviks was the tenacity and thoroughness with which they went to work. The strict discipline and thorough organization of their underground party, the indomitable ability and energy shown in the pursuit of their aims, startled the average Russian as something not only unusual but even uncanny. These qualities were indeed so alien from the usual national laxity that they could not but suggest a foreign origin. The more the revolution is studied, the more it becomes evident that it was Lenin's attitude to the problem of governmental power that gave him and his party the victory. Indeed, the Bolshevik attitude to power, their appetite for power, their already undeviating advance to it, and their continuous exercise and successful retention of it, constituted the crucial and unpassable line of demarcation between the Bolsheviks and the other socialist parties in Russia. There, in his admirably clear account of the conditions of the success of the Bolsheviks, Mr. Farbman has shown us how it was power, a love of it, and determination to obtain it, that enabled Lenin and his small party to reach the pinnacle they did. And, as Mr. Farbman started by saying, the important point to remember in any consideration of Russia is that a new ruling class is being formed, and further, that it is the first thing of that sort that the Russians have had. I will quote a few further passages from Mr. Farbman's book about the attitude of the usual Russian intellectual to the problem of power, and Kerensky's role. The Russian intellectuals had a pietistic abhorrence of power as a thing essentially evil, base, and degrading. Controlling most of the instruments of real power from the very moment of the March Revolution, the socialists were afraid not only to assume the government, but even to ask a share in it. Kerensky alone took the risk of entering the provisional government, but his decision aroused a storm of indignation among his fellow socialists, who only forgave him when he put forward the theory that he took office as a minister of justice, not in order to exercise power, but merely to secure the punishment of the enemies of the people, the leading members of the old regime. In accordance with this theory, Kerensky proclaimed himself a hostage of democracy in the first provisional government, not a member of it. The Bolsheviks were the only party of the left which definitely and persistently fought for power. But this thirst for power was so contrary to the traditions of Russian political life that even the Bolshevik rank and file had time and again to be reassured by Lenin that the assumption of power was necessary and by no means wicked or degrading. This clash of opinion and divergence of attitude towards power was the main if not the only cause of the conflict between the Bolsheviks and the Russian intellectuals. It is no exaggeration to say that the Russian intellectuals not only hated but loathed the Bolsheviks for sticking to power. The Bolsheviks were certainly not behindhand in reciprocating this hatred. They ridiculed the intellectuals as too pure-minded to do the dirty work of the world and only concerned with keeping their robes unsullied, and they actually persecuted them. The success of the Bolsheviks is due solely to their capacity for responding to this new spirit of action, of enterprise, and of acceptance of life. The Bolsheviks saw a new ruling class emerging in Russia, and were astute enough to maneuver themselves into the position of its leaders. To define in set terms this ruling class is impossible at this stage. The Bolsheviks, at any rate, were not anxious to give a very strict definition of the class in whose name they assumed the government. They proclaimed that the toiling masses, whoever these may be, alone possessed political rights. They excluded the exploiting elements, an equally vague class, from any exercise of such rights, and on this foundation they based a theory which permitted them to retain power exclusively in their hands.